Are you sick of manually having to trigger your cargo drones to go and get resources on their own to bring it back to your base? Well, guess what? I've got a drone for you. This one not only needs to have an empty cargo container, it also needs to have full power and full hydrogen tanks, as well as having an event controller looking at one of your cargo containers on your base to tell when the drone should trigger or when not to. This drone also has the ability to pull ammo resources from your main base to refill your drilling platform, which is represented by that black platform just over there, as well as having the ability to look for any enemies within a certain radius around this drone to trigger a flee timer to return back to your base to be nice and safe. The way I got this set up and the way I'm going to start with this is I've got 3 separate designs. This one here has only got the 2 remote blocks. Much easier, much simpler to use that drone compared to any other one. This one here is using 2 AI basic blocks, and this one here has got 2 AI recorder blocks. All 3 of these drones have also got at least 1 remote control on them and at least 1 AI defensive block to see the enemy radius and the enemy distance, comparing it to an actual event controller as well. But in the end, we will get there before the end of this episode. So if you want to know how I set this up and how I built it all, how I set it up, stick around to the end and hit that like, subscribe, and download this world for yourself using the link in the description below. So you can use all 3 of these drones just here to then set up yourselves using these 3 exact replicas of the drones behind them, except the ones in front are completely blank, ready and waiting for you yourself to copy all my programming on the timers, etc. over to this one, so you know why I put them there and which way I actually got them to trigger when they got triggered. So let's move on back to this 2 remote block drone, as it's much simpler to use this drone for the fact it only requires the 2 remote blocks, because you still need to have the ability to get in control of it with your player to place either the GPSs that the remote block uses and the AI basic, as well as being able to use the remote block to place the waypoints that these AI recorder blocks use to hit those GPSs to complete that actual GPS slot. So going back over to here, let's get into the terminal very quickly, and I'll try and peruse over it without getting into too much detail, as it could confuse you quite a bit. So when you manually trigger this, as it needs the manual trigger as well as the hands-free automatic trigger, and mind you, this has no mods, no DLCs, and no scripts whatsoever, so this design is completely 100% vanilla. Now, looking at the first timer block, that if I were to press this button that you saw at the start, it will manually trigger it up, and it will obviously just disconnect from the grid, turn on the remote controls autopilot going to the drill, which is why I have 2, and it will turn off its own collision avoidance, because if you trigger your drone on the actual base's grid with the collision avoidance on, it will not leave the connector's radius at all, because it's in its collision avoidance kind of circle and it doesn't know what to do. So I suggest you, at the same time, we'll go into that same timer, that trigger, start a separate timer and name it, I have the collision avoidance to start. And all that does is that it just turns both of the collision avoidances on both of those remote controls. So once you trigger this off, it will actually turn on the automatic pilot of the remote control to go to the drill. And if you don't know how to place GPSs or what a drone needs to actually function, including all of its hydrogen thrusters or thrust in all 6 directions, the power, the gyro, and antenna, the remote control, it's in a video in the link in the top right of your screen right now. I've got a part 3 tutorial that'll explain all that and more. So getting back to the remote control that goes to your drill, When it gets to the docking approach GPS, that's 60 meters directly above the docking connector, it's going to turn its collision avoidance off. It needs the collision avoidance off to run into the drill docks connector. It is what it is, you just have to have the collision avoidance off. So once it hits that drill dock approach and turns that collision avoidance off, it will drive or fly down to the drill dock itself right on the connector, directly on it. Once it gets there, it's going to trigger this load timer, this one right here, and it's going to turn off its autopilot as well as multiple other things, but we'll get there in just one moment. We'll go there step by step so you have a functioning drone that will at least go to and from your drilling platform, and then I'll get into the functionality of its 4 criteria it needs to meet to actually automatically trigger using these timer blocks up here. Once it gets to your drilling platform and it's actually locked onto its connector, it will use an event controller, this one right here, looking at all 4 of the cargo containers I have on the drone, and only when all 4 of them, using this AND gate button on, when all 4 of them have reached above 99.5%, so equal or greater than 99.5, it will trigger the RTB timer, this one right here. And the reason why I have this at 99.5 is you need at least a deficit of either side of at least 0.1 so it can actually trigger in the B option and then back to re-trigger option A, which is that RTB, which we'll get onto right now. The RTB timer is, I'm hoping you're following along in the World Save yourself firsthand using the link in the description below. Once it's filled its cargo container, it's going to obviously unlock from the drilling platform itself, turn on the to home base remote control, which is why we have 2, using that flea, but we'll get there in a second. But it will turn on the autopilot and turn off its collision avoidance to start with. Then it will start that collision avoidance timer. This one right here, after 5 seconds, it will turn both of the collision avoidance on both of those remote controls, so it won't run into anything along the way. So once it gets onto that remote control going back to your home base, it will then fly directly above your home docks connector, and it needs to be more than 25 meters, otherwise some of the AI blocks don't like it, but this is fine, it's only got the 2 remotes, so you're fine there. So once it's above your connector, it will turn off its collision avoidance on the correct remote control, the to home base. It will then fly down to your home dock, and it will trigger that unload timer. This one right here is obviously just going to turn its autopilot off, and it's going to lock to the base itself. Using this start connector, obviously when you want it to lock to a base, I have it to start a separate timer. This one here, the connector / sorter swap, allowing it to dock onto that connector after a certain amount of time, say 2 or 3 seconds, to give the magnetism of both the connectors more stability before locking to the grid. So that's why I have that, and these sorters are for a bit later on. I'll get to that very shortly. But that is what an entire trigger would look like going to and from your drilling platform. Now obviously, because underneath all this, I'll go over here and show the actual bare bones of this. This is the one with the 2 AI recorder blocks. You see there's the AI flight move and then the AI defensive. Obviously we still have that remote control, because otherwise we would not have the ability to control this drone ourselves with our player to place those waypoints or GPSs individually while in control of this grid. So I've got a sneaky sorter that you see just above that connector that's facing in the up direction that will pull any ore from your drilling platform when it gets turned on. Obviously it's got the correct settings to pull the correct ore out of wherever it is when it gets turned on. as well as having any other sorter like this one here that pushes the ore out through there and through the connector into your home base where it is now, which is why this is on, and that sorter in there behind the gyros is currently off. Otherwise it would currently loop all the way through and it would just never end. So that's why there's one here to turn the ore out or push the ore out, and when it gets to the drilling platform, there's that sorter there that will push it all into it when these are off at the same time. There's a couple of sorters right here that are on that connector sorter timer that also will pull ammo out of your home base and push it into your drilling platform using the same method I explained with that in sorter just there into your actual drone, and then out of your drone into the actual connector itself, bypassing each other. So make sure you got to do that. After that, let's get into how I've got it to flee before we get into how I've got it to automatically trigger. Hopefully you're not as bored as what it could be, and hopefully you're following along as much as possible. So along its way to or from either the drill or the home base, I have this event controller that is actually selecting that AI defensive combat block I have on this grid and telling it to, whenever it is within a certain distance of a locked target equal or less than 1250 meters, it will trigger this flee timer. And this flee timer, it's actually really quite simple. It just turns one autopilot off and one collision avoidance off. Sorry, this one it turns off, the one that goes to the drill, and it turns that collision avoidance off, while also telling it to go home using that to home base remote control nice and easily with that collision avoidance on straight away, as this drone would be in the air when this timer would be triggered. It would also turn off that AI defensive block and that event controller so it cannot be re-triggered and screw up any of the programming. So if you click on any one of these pages right here and you press your period or your comma keys, you can actually go through all of these separate pages and you've got multiple of all of them. So if we go to the next page, I've also got this flee timer to turn on the low resources timer and to start it. That is very important for the fact that that is the automatic trigger resetting itself and telling the rest of the drone that it has had a flee trigger and it still needs resources. So once it gets back to the base, it will then trigger again once more nice and neatly, automatically, completely hands-free. And obviously with these conveyor sorters, this is what it will do to pull or push that ore in or out, as well as that ammo. So that's what these are for, as well as what it does over here on the connect sorter swap. Just does the same thing. It just turns them all on and off. So every time I trigger this timer, it will switch them over, as when the drone is at your base, it will start with either the ore out and the ore in, either on or off respectively, so it will have the re-trigger, so one is turned on while the other is turned off. I hope that makes sense as well, and my voice is getting a little bit raspy. Alright, now we've got a working drone. Let's give it some brains and tell it when it can automatically trigger with these visual representations of these text panels. There's a lot to go on here, and I'm going to try and explain it as fast as I possibly can while being as thorough as I can. So the way it works is that it's using 4 separate event controllers looking at 4 separate things. This one is looking at all of the hydrogen tanks on the drone itself, and only when it is above 99.9% and when they are all at above 99.9% will it then trigger the actual timer block H2 power OK to turn on. This one here with the power, similar very thing. Once it's equal or greater than 99.9% of the drone's battery, it will then start that exact same H2 power okay. So with these being both okay, which they are now, the power is okay and it's triggered, and so is the H2. So that means the battery and the tanks are completely full. So this timer block has then been started and turned on. And what this does is that it will just turn on the auto trigger timer right here. So this one is currently on, awaiting for the other two event controllers to be actually triggered, telling it it's ready and waiting. So this event controller is looking at all of the cargo drones on the drone itself, all respectively using this AND gate. When it gets below 1%, it will tell the low resource timer to turn on. Once your base, and this is what this event controller does, this is looking at a cargo container on your base, that once it drops below 5% of whatever is in it, I've currently got 60,000 gold ore, I think I have, because that is one of the heaviest ores in this game, and that's what I'm using for this test purpose. Once it gets below 5%, it will then start that low resource timer. So once all of these conditions are met, it will then turn on both of these timers and start both of them to be triggered. Each of them will be turning on and starting this auto trigger to be triggered once all four of those criteria have been met. Once that is done, and all this drone is waiting for, obviously from its visual representation, is your base to be lower, or this cargo container here, to be lower than 5%. Once that's done, this text panel will light up and it will automatically trigger along its way. So let's do that nice and quickly right now, and I'll explain how that's all done, because once that auto trigger timer has been triggered and turned on and started, using those event controllers and flowing through that list, there we go, below 5%, turn that drain all sorter into that white container off to get it below that 5%. That's how I just did that. You'll see it'll have an automatic trigger, hands-free, to then go about its business while flashing everything that's ready. So obviously the power and the hydrogen is not at 100%, which is why both of these conditions are not met. Obviously now it's at my temporary drilling platform, that's what this represents. It is now filling it up with cargo, and it is now not meeting that criteria, saying it is filled with cargo and it is not empty. That's what that text panel says. So this is now looking at an event controller. I'm going to turn off this AI autopilot, this remote control autopilot, so I can explain something very quickly. Once it's at your drilling platform, it's looking at this event controller cargo load. And what this is doing is that it's doing very similarly to what the drone check does, but in the opposite. It looks at all the drone's cargo container, and once they're all above 99.5%, it will then trigger that RTB timer to go onto that second control to go back to your home base. Now, the reason why I've actually stopped it on its autopilot halfway is because I want to get in control of this. So I'm just going to look elsewhere, use my player's antenna while following this drone, and control the drone from where it sits right now. Look, there we go. There's my player. He's just going to follow along. And what I'm going to do is, I wish that guy was out of the way just a smidge. There we go. Turn my HUD on just a smidge, and we've got an enemy over there to trigger this flee timer to return back to base automatically. There it goes right there. Very simply, very easily. Now, obviously, with this being triggered now on its way back to the home base, already having cargo or ore in it already, it will already start using this flee timer. It will automatically turn on that low resource timer and as well start it. What's it doing? Okay, so that's why you don't wait too long. Let's go ahead and trigger that back up and we'll get back to what we were doing before. So getting back to it, I've just reloaded the save very quickly, and let's re-trigger this once again by draining all of the ore out of this green cargo container into the white one on the right to get it below that 5% just there, just like that. So let's lock onto this drone, and once again I'm just going to stop it midway from actually completing its journey, just like so, and I'm going to get in control of this drone once again, fly towards the enemy, and wait for the flee timer to be automatically triggered once within 1250 meters, just like so. So now, because I have this drone on 2 separate remote blocks, where are you? There you are. I have it set to turn the autopilot on the to home remote block. And the reason why I have 2 separate remote blocks instead of one using 4 GPSs is for the ability of this flee function. If I didn't have the 2 separate remote blocks and only the one, I would not be able to specifically tell it to only start halfway through its GPS list in its block. Just doesn't work. So since that flee timer has been triggered, it still needs ore and the cargo is still empty. So I've got that flee timer to turn on and to start that low resource timer. So all it's waiting for is for the hydrogen and the batteries to be back at 100% for it to be re-triggered automatically, because you're still in need of those resources. And then it will obviously continue on, go to your actual drilling platform, and then straight back to home base. So now that the cargo is completely full, or filling up as we speak, it is no longer empty and that text panel has been turned off, as well as your hydrogen tanks and your batteries no longer being at 100%, which is why this visual representation is no longer there. It will now obviously trigger that RTB timer because those cargo containers are completely full. It triggered that RTB timer to fly on back to your base. Really nice and simply, just like so. Here we go, coming on down nice and easy, and boom, just like so. So now the need ore, there we go, it just disappeared because now the cargo behind me is above 5%, so it no longer needs resources. Obviously the power will flick on and off because when a battery on a drone that's connected to a base reaches 100% charge, your base sees it as its own battery, so it will pull charge from it periodically while recharging it back up to the top, even though it is on the automatic function. As you can see, the hydrogen tanks are now completely full and the cargo is now empty. This drone is now just awaiting either manual trigger using this button 1 just here, or for when this cargo container right here will be dropping below the 5% value as it's at 8.34 now. The reason I have this build vision is a mod just for me to have the ability to see that percentage. But everything you see here on this drone in this episode has no mods, no DLCs, no scripts, nada. It is 100% vanilla, and I do appreciate if you're still watching now. I hope I haven't melted your brain and it was easy enough to understand how this all works. If you want any more information or whatever it may be, let me know in the comments below. Like the video so it can be put out to more people on that YouTube algorithm. And yeah, subscribe with that bell icon for more videos like this, as I'm sure drones and automation is really my thing and you're definitely going to be seeing a lot more than that. So till then, make sure you stay sharp. See ya. Have a good one.